Good afternoon. I'm Bob Shrum, the director of the Center for the Political Future at USC Dornsife. Today in our Bully Pulpit series, the last episode of this semester actually, we are welcoming Ben Rhodes to discuss his new book, After the Fall, Being an American in the World We've Made. I'll leave time toward the end of this, 15 or 20 minutes, for audience questions. If you have a question, put it in the chat. Ben was Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speechwriting under President Obama. He co-hosts the widely popular podcast, brilliantly named Pod Save the World. He is also a former fellow at the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. It was a privilege to have him with us and an extraordinary opportunity for our students. So Ben, I'm going to jump right in with this. It's a fundamental question that you aim to answer in the book. What do you think it means to be an American in what you describe as a world gone wrong?
Yeah, Bob, well, thanks. It's great to be with you. And I love that time too at the Center for the Political Future. I actually wrote a chunk of my book teaching a class on authoritarianism when I was there. And the students really helped me think through some things. A central premise of the book, right, is I look at a period of history from the fall of the Berlin Wall, kind of the apex of America's sense of itself in the world, to where we are now. So there's a couple of falls along the way. And one of the things that I kind of had to wrestle with is the degree to which, I came of age at a time when Americans were kind of ingrained with a sense of exceptionalism, that the big battles had been won, that democracy had prevailed, that the future was somewhat inevitably moving in the direction of more open societies, more tolerant and progressive societies. And part of what has happened is a return of history with a vengeance. And what I wrestle with in the book is not only is the United States on the receiving end of rising authoritarianism around the world, we ourselves have contributed to it a lot through our social media platforms that we created, through our post 9/11 policies, which have often fueled authoritarianism and us versus them politics. And through, I think, the void that our victory in the Cold War left when global capitalism kind of intruded upon people's sense of traditional identity and created inequities that strong men could take advantage of. And so in that context, though, to me, the things that we took as given are not what makes us American. It's doing the work. And I think that's something that, two of our former bosses, Barack Obama and Ted Kennedy, that we are not granted these values. We don't live in a country that has realized these values when we talk about equality and the values of our founding. We have an opportunity to do the work of pursuing them. And at no point in my life has doing that work been more necessary than right now, because at no point in my life is the gap between what the story America tells about itself, who we are at home and what we are in the world, kind of further away from the reality of where that story is. And so being American is closing that distance between the story we tell about ourselves and the reality, in my view.
Yeah. Let me follow up with something I wasn't sure I was going to ask, but given what you just said, I want to raise it. There seems to be enormous resistance and now the politicization of any attempt to tell what you call the story of reality about America. We saw that in the Virginia governor's race. We've seen it in other places. How do we get to the point where Americans can understand what your former boss, President Obama, used to say was our real task, which was to perfect the Union? Not to say we were perfect, but to perfect it and to recognize where we fall short.
I mean, I think that's a central question. And first of all, I think it's widespread. I mean, in my corner of the world of what I used to work on, we have not had an honest conversation in this country about the failure of the entire post 9/11 enterprise. Afghanistan was interesting because in the criticism that Biden was taking, part of what was absent was like the reality of the last 20 years. Like this wasn't going well up until Joe Biden pulled out. That's just one piece of a much broader American problem where we have trouble, whether it's dealing with our history, whether it's dealing with societal inequality, economic inequality, whether it's aspects of our foreign policy. We have a big problem often in course correcting in this country, and that causes us to compound the holes that we're in. Like you could see the explosion of economic inequality, to take one issue, coming out of the 80s. And Bob, you ran on a lot of campaigns that focused on this. And yet you could see that was going to create societal strains. You could see that could create openings for populism. You could see that could create distrust of government. And yet we just keep digging. We keep doing the same things that exacerbate inequality. So to me, I make that point that yes, it's structural racism and critical race theory and all the rest of the historical aspects, but it's also even more recent events where we just have a hard time owning it. I do think that the innovation that Obama had on this is something that I think needs to permeate the Democratic Party more today, which is that he could talk about the need for change without asking people to reject what happened in the past, without asking people to kind of renounce parts of their identity they were proud of. What he could say is that American history is a continuum, and actually the work of acknowledging where we've come up short and doing better is an extension of what came before, not a rejection of it. We were imperfect at our founding, but we were telling a really good story. And each generation of Americans, in Obama's telling of the story, kind of has their baton run to make something better. And I think what is just someone who's worked on this in politics, not as much as you, but for 2 presidential campaigns, what someone's not going to listen to you when you're telling them about something that's wrong if you're kind of asking them to give up the entire mythology that they grew up with, about what kind of country America was, about the American dream, about aspects of American history that people are proud of. And so you have to create a space to have the honest conversation, and to create that space, whether you like it or not, you have to engage that person from a point of what are they proud of, not what are they ashamed of. And you have to make it a point of pride, at least this is what I saw Obama do quite well, in people kind of taking another step forward. And it's harder to start that conversation when it's about asking people to acknowledge things that they believe that are no longer true.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about Obama. I recall that in his announcement speech, and then in the speech he gave at Constitution Hall in Philadelphia, the National Constitution Center, at the height of the Jeremiah Wright controversy, he actually praised the founding fathers.
Yeah.
Which is something you don't always hear these days from a lot of other Democrats. So you can respond to that if you want, or I'll move on.
No, I just think that's exactly right. And he would, if you go back and listen to the in no other country is my story possible, a lot, the founders, like he situated this very 2.0 version of the American story, Barack Hussein Obama, in the continuum from the founders through, World War II and these, and so he is an extension of that. He's not a repudiation of it. And I think that created a permission structure for a bunch of people to vote for him who might not otherwise have done it.
Yeah, I think Democrats have to get back to that too. But now I want to move on in terms of the book. I was really struck by the fact that you mentioned that you felt like an exile in your own country during your time in the White House. What did you mean by that?
I mean, really 2 things. One was the degree to which the severity of the shift to Trump. I'm spit out after 8 years. That's already going to be a disorienting experience. But there's Donald Trump, who represents kind of the opposite of everything I believe in. And particularly because he embraced this kind of nationalist, authoritarian, right-wing brand of politics. The symbols, everything from the flag to the White House itself to the kind of trappings of American power in the world, the symbols became polluted and became complicated for me. I couldn't feel quite the same emotion, right? Like looking at symbols of American democracy, knowing that it was essentially corrupted. I think more interestingly, though, Bob, like I write about this experience in the book of learning a couple years out of the White House that through the press that I was being spied on by Black Cube, which is an outfit of former Mossad agents that had been enlisted to do everything from spying on Harvey Weinstein's accusers, trying to dig up dirt on them, to spying on me, and it was disorienting. And it was the allegation was that some kind of Trump associates had hired these people to dig up dirt on me, vaguely because of the Iran nuclear deal. But then I described this experience of my literary agent saying, hey, your Google is a dumpster fire. You should talk to one of these people who kind of cleans up your reputation online. I thought, oh, that's kind of gross. Like, I don't know if I want to do that. But when I talked to that guy, what he said is like, look, we couldn't really do this for you anyway, because based on our analysis of your online profile, someone is running a systematic disinformation campaign against you, to make all the bad stuff about you be what populates the internet and stuff like that. And so the combination of, and never mind the fact that I was hauled in front of, Trey Gowdy and House Republican investigative committees. So in addition to kind of just that emotional feeling of exile from the center of American kind of democracy, I had this tiny little taste, and I don't want to compare it to people like Alexei Navalny, who I talked to in the book, but, of being hounded, right? Like I've got private spies trying to dig up dirt on me. I've got people running information operations against me. I'm getting hauled in front of congressional committees about stuff about conspiracy theories, basically, that weren't true. And it was a reminder that, like, we are, this did not happen 10 years ago, like we are drifting in a direction where being in the political opposition, if you will, of in particular, the kind of Trumpian brand of Republican is increasingly, it's not yet dangerous, but it has early stage characteristics of what happens to people in semi-autocracies. And given that everybody else I was talking to for this book was basically in some fashion an oppositionist or dissident or what have you, seeing aspects of the American experience that are beginning to look like places that we think of as very different than America was an interesting exercise.
So you write about those individual dissidents in places like Russia, Hungary, and Hong Kong. Why did you think it was so important to look at global events through the perspective of their individual lives?
Well, first of all, because a core idea of this book is that we can understand what's happening in America by looking at America from the outside in. And the jumping off point for me really was I was talking to this Hungarian anti-corruption activist. And I said, well, how did your country go from being this liberal democracy in 2010 when Viktor Orban was elected prime minister to basically being a single party autocracy today, albeit with elections? And he said, well, that's simple. Viktor Orban got elected in 2010 on a right-wing populist backlash to the financial crisis. Then he packed the courts with far-right judges who would find in favor of his power grabs. He changed the voting laws to make it easier for his supporters to vote and harder for others. He redrew the parliamentary districts to vastly favor his party and kind of entrench them in power. He enriched some cronies on the outside through corruption, who then financed Orban's politics, bought up the media, and turned it into a right-wing propaganda machinery. And he wrapped the whole thing up in an us versus them nationalist message: us, the real Hungarians, against them, Muslims, immigrants, George Soros. And he's talking, and I'm like, well, this is the precise experience that I lived from 2010 when the Tea Party came into power until today, in almost every way. And so I just wanted to start to pull the thread on what can we learn about what's happened in America through the experience of authoritarianism in these three places that are different flavors. Hungary is kind of the closest to the American flavor, and that's why you have Tucker Carlson and Mike Pence and all these guys going over there to hang out with Orban. Russia was kind of the template for Hungary. And so Russia, in many ways, kind of anticipates the playbook that is migrated to the West. And then China represents kind of the alternative future of where authoritarianism is going. And through the experience of all these different individuals in these different places, I wanted to give the flavor of what it's like to live through this period of time, and what can we learn about why we got here from these individual stories, and what can we learn about how people are pushing back in the hopes that we might learn lessons from that.
Yeah, listening to you, I'm struck by the thought that what's happened in America is actually now helping to hurt democracy or helping to discredit democracy around the world. That for a long time, people looked to us as a model, whether you had a Republican or a Democratic president. They looked to us as a model. And, you know, Jimmy Carter went around the world supervising elections or monitoring elections. Do you think that the events of the last 10 years and then the Trump years have degraded the image of America as a democracy and had a knock-on effect in all these other countries?
Yes, 100%. And I found that everywhere I went. And I'll give two. I'll give two anecdotes that drove this home to me that I use in the book. You know, one was Alexei Navalny, right, who's the chief opponent to Putin, currently in prison for a crime he didn't commit after being poisoned for a second time by the Russian government, almost killed. And Navalny was telling me, you know, look, here's the thing you have to understand about Putin. Putin doesn't need to convince his own people that he is not corrupt. The cat's out of the bag to some extent on that, although he that's a vulnerability for him. What Putin's goal is to convince you that everybody's corrupt. There's no difference, that America is no more quote unquote democratic than Russia. It's all bullshit. It's all a game that's rigged for people at the top. So you might as well, in that world, have a strong man who at least kind of gives meaning to your identity and gives expression to your grievances and hates the same people that you do and that kind of thing. And he said that, there were two things that were really important in fueling that narrative for Putin. One was the financial crisis, because that made it, and this is something I heard again and again, that the American system itself was so corrupt that, a global cataclysm can take place and all the people who caused it are still rich. And the degree to which Putin kind of played into that. But then even more importantly was Trump. And Navalny said to me, look, my whole life I've been making an argument. I quote this in the book. He says, my whole life I've been making an argument that in a democracy, the people that rise to the top are less corrupt. And he's like, here is somebody who is so obviously corrupt that, as Navalny told me, like any Russian cab driver on the street can look at that and think, well, Putin's right. Look at their system. Like, look at that guy. That guy who gets to the top of American democracy. Why is democracy any better than what we have here? It's the same thing. And that's why I used to always explain to people when they'd ask me, like, why did Putin want Trump to win so much? Did he want sanctions relief in Ukraine? No, he wanted that. He wanted to show that democracy was hopelessly corrupt. The other thing that struck me is I was in Japan. I tell this story. I was meeting with like a group of the business leaders in Japan. And I thought it was there to talk about foreign policy, and it was during one of the North Korea flare-ups. So I thought that's what they all want to talk about. And every one of them, almost every one of them asked me and said about Charlottesville and Trump and white supremacy and really searching questions. And I realized that in a way, to them, the United States turning into that was far more dangerous than North Korea. Because every assumption that they'd made in their whole lives about how the world operated, Japan's alliance with the United States is kind of, they may not like all of American foreign policy, but the kind of stability of American democracy, which Japan has obviously built on that model. If that's out the window, then where do they turn, right? And so how I experience is, yes, we've lost that credibility. That's hurt people who draw on the power of our example, like a Navalny, and that's broken the trust with allies who kind of depend on us to be the anchor of the global democratic world. And that's, I think, what accounts for the fact that if you look around the world today, everything feels very unmoored, very unsteady. Even with Joe Biden in office, I think those feelings are still very much there.
Yeah, so you mentioned China earlier as a kind of new and different form of authoritarianism and nationalism, and you spent a lot of time in Hong Kong as well, talking with dissidents, and you saw how the party quelled the protests there. How is China's nationalism and its authoritarianism different than, say, Hungary or Russia?
So the nationalism is quite similar. And I was struck by this because you think of China as a communist party. But I had a guy who had been in Tiananmen Square and then become this kind of fascinating publisher of kind of anti-Chinese Communist Party books out of Hong Kong. He and some others walked me through how after Tiananmen Square, part of what they did is they rebranded themselves from a communist party to more of a nationalist party. And that meant that everything changed from the party, resurrecting Confucius as an iconic figure after having kind of banished him in the 20th century, to the curriculum in schools being much more nationalist, to the kind of anti-Western, anti-Japanese flavor in the media. They kind of steadily built this model where they were no longer the vanguard of worldwide revolution. They were now the vanguard of Chinese identity. Now, what's different is the tools that they acquired along the way and the way that they use them to shape their system. And really it's technology. And in Hong Kong, the story I asked everybody is like, tell me what was your experience of authoritarianism kind of bleeding into your life? And it was very technologically focused in the sense that it used to be this very free and open society. Then things started to get more restrictive on like kind of what kind of protests you could have and things like that. But then it just kind of started to become known as, and they called this the white terror in Hong Kong. Don't post anything on social media that might be perceived as critical of the Chinese government, because that could harm your capacity to get a job that depends on the Chinese marketplace. And a lot of Hong Kong's economy does. And that even then blended into, don't even write anything in an email, because the assumption is every email is checked against some keywords. And even if you say something in email, and then that it bleeds into like, are people surveilling my phone? And there's constant shifting around which encrypted app. And at the same time, the curriculum is starting to change in the Hong Kong schools. Suddenly you're supposed to stand up and sing the Chinese Communist Party anthem. Suddenly, you're learning about a different version of history. And it started to bleed into culture. So like a Hong Kong pop singer, for instance, made some comment, that was friendly to Taiwan, and she gets basically canceled, and bombarded with millions of Chinese Twitter users, and she's banned from the Chinese market. And so that before there were security services in the streets, and that's where Hong Kong protests ended up. What they experienced was this encroachment of what life is like actually in China. And if you look at mainland China, they have created a total surveillance state where they are monitoring, what your keywords are on the internet, what patterns of data you're leaving behind. And they're deploying a massive artificial intelligence capacity to kind of sort out who's trustworthy and who's potentially untrustworthy. And if you say the wrong thing, or if you're just insufficiently patriotic in your digital footprint, which is very vast today, you might wonder not whether necessarily you're going to get thrown in prison, but maybe your kid won't get into a good school. Maybe you won't get a job. And so there's this effort to deploy technology kind of holistically across the whole society to shape individual choices. And that goes far beyond a Russia or Hungary, where, if in Russia, they can use it to intimidate you, but they don't have the wherewithal to do what China's doing. But the danger is China's starting to export some of those technologies.
So what you're really saying, I think, is that the combination of social media and artificial intelligence is enabling this trend toward more authoritarian governments that exercise more control over their people. It's a pretty depressing picture. Can we do anything about it?
Yeah, it is a depressing picture in the sense that, because what's interesting about it is one way for Americans to think about this is it's about big data and artificial intelligence. And so you experience this on a corporate level if you're American. There's a reason why they know how to target you with certain ads, and they anticipate what your Google search is going to be. In China, it's the same data set, except probably more expansive because China collects a lot of data on citizens, deployed for political purposes by the state. And so just think if instead of it being, like some anonymous corporate behemoth, it was a kind of totalitarian state that had access to all your data and was using it to kind of shape you and your choices. Yeah, we can do a lot about it, I think. First and foremost, we have to kind of get our own house in order, right? Generally speaking, and there's a lot to that. The one thing I'd point out for starters is social media. These are American platforms, so the disinformation coursing through the veins of global politics is emanating from this country, which means it can be regulated by our government. And so, why we are not at a minimum seeking to regulate social media and the development of new data mining technologies in ways that safeguard privacy, that diminish conspiracy theory and the spread of hate speech. These are within our control. These are man-made platforms. They're human-written algorithms. They're within the regulatory and antitrust purview of the United States government. And so to me, this is step one in terms of addressing this nexus of technology and authoritarianism. They're available tools. I think beyond that, we have to think about what the story of democracy is going forward. That we're not going to change a Chinese, one of the conclusions I draw about Hong Kong, where I'm literally interacting with these people as their city is being suffocated. And people that I met in Hong Kong for this book now are in exile in places like London, Australia. And I knew there's nothing we could do to help them. No foreign policy was going to save Hong Kong. What they really need, and what they told me essentially, is for the world to change. It's not going to be a sudden change in the Chinese Communist Party's view towards Hong Kong. It's going to be 10 or 20 years from now. Will the pendulum have swung back sufficiently in the world in favor of democratic behaviors and norms that they can return to a Hong Kong that is freer, and that requires, I think, less the confrontation with the Chinese model and more the fortification and strengthening of the democratic alternative so that pendulum can swing back.
Okay, you also talked about the economic roots of a lot of this, Orban and Putin exploiting what happened in the financial crisis. How is the economy contributing to this now? I mean, what impact are economic factors having on what's going on today as distinct from 10 years ago?
I think that, part of what there were kind of three stages of this problem that, again, Bob, you were out on the forefront of this politically in this country, that I see. The first was that period from the 90s through the financial crisis, when even before the bottom fell out, inequality is really getting out of control. People can sense that. So all these countries I'm looking at, Hungary and Russia, China, they're all on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So they experienced the kind of incoming of capitalism. And yet standards of living, they all describe a similar dynamic where initially standards of living go up and everybody feels good about that. But you're losing something, right? There's a homogenization of culture happening, and everything feels like a chain, and the old buildings are getting knocked down. And so people are already feeling unsettled. Then the bottom falls out, and it's like, wait a second, this whole thing is a house of cards. I just lost, all my savings. I've also lost my sense of identity in this globalization deal, and I'm pissed about it. And the global economy has kept moving, but I think the last 10 years where we are today is the risk is, I think, extreme kind of cynicism about capitalism. The rich just keep getting exponentially richer before our eyes. There is corruption scandal after corruption scandal. The Pandora Papers, in some other age and time would have been a much bigger deal. But what's that surprising about foreign leaders stashing tens of billions of dollars in tax havens? Or it's depressing the degree to which this is all kind of baked in. And there's this, but that's that Navalny point about people don't like that, but they also think it's incorrectable. They don't believe that anybody's trying to deal with inequality in extreme wealth and tax cheating and corruption, right? And so to me, what the battle we're facing today is the battle against cynicism. Things can change, and even the powerful things that the Biden team is doing, they don't seem to be translating into a story that people feel that something fundamental is shifting, right? And that's not to lay blame, because we clearly in the Obama years, same thing with things. A lot of indicators went up, and we did some good things, healthcare, and but the people just feel like the story, they've lost a grip on the economic story that they're living in, and I think that makes it much more likely that people will vote on issues that are not economic issues, because the identity-based issues feel more weirdly impacted by politics than the economic ones, even if that's not the case.
So to go to those identity issues, how does the challenge of immigration, refugees, what we're seeing on the border in Eastern Europe, how does that feed into this? Because it seems to me, and you talk about this too, but it seems to me that so much of this is driven by fear of the other, that the other is dangerous.
Yeah, I think that it's central to the politics. It's not the root cause, though. One of the reasons I wrote this book was I didn't believe there were so many theories of Trump. Remember after 2016, and the one that was kind of popular in my somewhat nerdy global circles was everything was about the refugee crisis. That like things are going along, and then the refugee crisis happened in 2015, and then you got Brexit and Trump, and I didn't like that because it ignored the fact that I'd felt rising authoritarianism the entire time through the Obama presidency, including in my own country with the Tea Party and the kind of abandonment of democratic norms by the Republican Party, in the rise of people like Orban before the refugee crisis internationally, in a much more sort of Putin across the board. So I think the refugee crisis became a symptom of, again, this identity question where one of the things that I went through, Bob, in writing the book was in each country, I heard a lot about the 20th century. And part of what I heard is that the 20th century became about these isms, right? Communism versus democratic capitalism, before that fascism, big ideological debates. When you removed those isms from kind of the global debate, it's kind of natural that everything reverted back to identity, because the 21st century contests are about not communism versus democracy. It's China, Russia, the US, Europe. We're kind of back in the world as it normally is, where it's like big nationalist powers competing. And so people were already moving in that direction. In the West, the immigration issue has been the most potent issue in motivating a nationalist fervor. And in this country, part of what I found in reflecting on my experience in politics in the 21st century, Bob, is that like post 9/11, a massive other is created. We are at war on terror, whatever that is. And at the beginning, the enemy is very much Al-Qaeda and the terrorists. And then there's a lot of adjacent stuff to that, radical Islam, et cetera. Creeping Sharia law in the United States. Remember when that was a thing? The pack of wolves circling at the end of the Bush 04 campaign. What's interesting, I think, is as those wars lost luster because they weren't being the great victories that Bush had promised, the other became the immigrant at the southern border. The same xenophobic segments that used to run on Fox about the war on terror are now about the border. And so there was an other that could just be repurposed. I think in Europe, obviously, that other is immigrant populations that are changing kind of the ethnically homogeneous feel of nation states. And I think the basic conundrum facing liberals, progressives, socialists in the West is part of our comparative advantage and the contrast that we draw with the China is that we're multicultural, multiracial societies. But part of the challenge in pushing back against nationalism in our own countries is not allowing the politics of immigration to have nationalists installed in our countries. And so like we have to preserve what is core to our identity as multiracial, multi-ethnic democracies. And I think in the long run, a comparative advantage to China or Russia, and that we have these big, diverse, enriching populations. But how do you manage that in a way that doesn't play into the politics of people that scapegoat immigration all the way to power? And that's a delicate balancing.
Toward the end of the book, you write, and this is a quote, "For me, the experience of looking into the eye of where America has gone wrong has only made me love more fiercely what America is supposed to be." What can we do as individuals? What can Americans do as individuals to advance President Obama's aspiration for America to be a promised land? I mean, we've been talking about all the problems. How do we get out of this?
I think, first of all, on a global scale, you'd asked, we talked before, we had kind of the depressing talk about America losing credibility. I actually think there's a huge opportunity, though, for America to win its credibility back, because we're now recognizable. And we're not issuing statements and speeches about democracy from the mountaintop, to the small people around the world. We're in the same soup as everybody else. People around the world have seen, we can have a corrupt autocrat with son-in-law down the hall. We can have a mob storm the parliament. That happens everywhere, right? If we can fight through this, then we're setting a very relevant example to the rest of the world. In terms of what people can do, part of what I found is, because I get the question a lot, what gives you hope? Part of what gives me hope today versus 10 years ago is we are having very core conversations about what our democracy is, about what American identity is, about the stakes in public life and politics. I think that, and when I engage with younger people, what I'm finding is that, you are making decisions in all that you do about these questions. So in other words, the easy answer to give, and it's the right answer, right, is everybody can participate in the political process. People can vote, people can organize, people can donate, people can join a cause, etc. But I'm saying even beyond that or underneath that, living the identity that you would like to see reflected in your country in all that you do, I think is kind of where we're at today. And part of what you'll find is that people on the other side of this debate, and it's not Democratic or Republican, because part of what I find hopeful in America too is that there's a kind of small d Democratic coalition that goes beyond just a Democratic Party that needs to hold the line, if you will. But the people on the other side of this, they live it, and they live it. They live it in their politics. They live it in their jobs. They live it in their school boards. And I think that all of us have a role to play in living as the type of citizens that we want our country to be, right? And that, that's a powerful, that if you start to apply that prism to how you live in your community, how you interact in your workplace, what you do with your extra time, how you engage in political debates, I think that, applying that prism kind of globally, if enough people do that, we'll be fine. Because at the end of the day, there are far more people that believe in, I believe, there are far more people that believe in the better story of an America that privileges equality than the other team, but we all have to show up on the field.
We have a lot of questions from the audience, so I think I'm going to move to those. So the first question is from Alexandra Dukovska, and if I mispronounced your name, I apologize. What are the prospects for a renewed Iran nuclear deal?
I mean, I think they're not great. They're under 50%. I mean, the timing kind of got crosswise because Trump, on the way out the door, piles up a whole bunch of new sanctions on Iran. Biden comes in order to rejoin the deal quickly. He would have had to just kind of lift those sanctions as a part of the deal, and he's doing a bunch of other stuff, and pandemic, et cetera. By the time the Biden team is turning to this in the spring, the Iranians are entering an election cycle that produces a hardliner. So we just lost kind of a year here as Iran's nuclear program is expanding. I still think that despite the hardline government in Iran, like this is still the best of all the alternatives for everybody, including the Iranians. And so that's why there's still a possibility of a deal. I think what you might also see, though, is a less comprehensive deal where Iran, might stop what they're doing in advancing their program and change for more limited sanctions, and then we have more diplomacy. The great irony of that is that would be a far weaker deal than the original Iran deal, which was held up as not strong enough. So the net result of Trump tearing this deal up and causing this multi-year international crisis for basically no reason is that the best we might be able to get is a less good version of the deal. But that too is the insanity of aspects of American policy.
Well, here's another question. This is from Terrence Graham, who I think is pretty disillusioned with our politics from the tone of this question. He says, in many ways, U.S. financial and legal services have served as the facilitators of authoritarian capitalism. For example, Russia and China, they profited enormously from this endeavor. I'm referring here to the McKinseys, the Deloittes, and the tax optimization schemes that have sucked capital out of countries and into the shell accounts of political leaders and their cronies. Can we fix this when these very actors are so entwined with our own political parties?
So I encourage you to pick up the book because I don't shy away from this. The American supported privatization schemes in Russia in the 90s basically created this oligarchic state that Putin could then take over. The American, in addition to what's mentioned in the question, take China. The American venture capital that financed the very surveillance technologies I'm talking about, it wasn't just Chinese government investment. It was a lot of American dollars flowing in China. The American kind of made financial schemes that contribute to inequality. I mean, there's a lot, that we have to answer for. I tried to write about this as, really bluntly as someone who's used to be in the American government, because I do think there's a danger. I love Anne Applebaum. She has a cover piece in the Atlantic on global authoritarianism, and it's great on its subject matter. What's missing a little bit is that we contributed to the problem through our financial sector and our military. I mean, look at some of the worst dictators in the world are American-backed, right? Egypt, Saudi Arabia. Anyway, so that's the long self-own that I think that Americans need to do to have ears open. What I would say though is that if you don't like that, you just got to keep trying to elect people who will change it. There's not. I mean, this is a lot of what we're talking about, and a lot of what's embedded in that question has its origin in the 80s in the Reagan election, and then the Reagan kind of dismantling of the regulatory state, and continued with vigor by the kind of Republican Congress. And I guess what I'd say is that the Democratic Party's been in bed with some of these interests or aspects of the Democratic Party, but that's changed a pretty good amount. And when I look at the Democratic Party's view of tax policy and regulation, just to take one aspect of this, today, it is far more skeptical than in 2009, even after the financial crisis when Obama's elected and has these big Democratic majorities, where there's one Joe Manchin today, like there were 15 Joe Manchins in the Senate in 2009. So I, when people are cynical about this, you can be correct in your cynicism, but the challenge is the only solution to that and only recourse for that is a combination of political action and elections, and then I think kind of cultural or bottom-up pressure on certain companies and behaviors. And I think it's having a difference. I mean, the agenda today is different because of the views expressed in that question and how widespread they are.
Okay, question 3 comes from Hugo. What about Latin America? Because the cases you're describing in Hungary and Russia seem to fit remarkably well with cases like Brazil, Nicaragua, and even El Salvador, Honduras. Does this reflect a wider blind spot of the American policy establishment?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is I could have and even contemplated early in this process doing Brazil, doing India, doing Israel, doing the Philippines. It is, unfortunately, there's ample evidence of the nationalist authoritarian trend I'm talking about in the book. I followed the path I did because it just kind of, I began in Hungary, and Hungary kind of led directly to Russia, and then China leads me back to the future. But I think that if you look at Latin America, what's interesting in Latin America is that there's two kind of flavors of authoritarianism in Latin America. There's still the old left flavor, right? The Cuban, Venezuelan, which I interacted with a ton in government, negotiating with the Cubans. But that to me is not where the energy is. That's still a huge challenge. But the energy is in this kind of more nationalist vein, and that's, I think Bolsonaro is the perfect expression of that. He's almost like a guy you could create in a lab to manifest this trend. I do think what's interesting about it, though, is that Venezuela, which started as an ideologically leftist project, is now kind of just a kleptocracy, right? So Venezuela has become more like, one of these kind of right-wing petrostates than it started out as. It's this kind of weird blend of a left-wing system and a kleptocracy. But I do think that the general challenge in Latin America is there's a similar dissatisfaction with established order. And so you can have people as diverse as AMLO in Mexico, Bukele, Bolsonaro, in his own way, Maduro, Daniel Ortega, very different politics there. Crypto bro, Sandinista, Trumpian guy, left-wing populist in Mexico, but they're all tapping into just people don't trust systems and are willing, therefore, to trust strongmen. And I do believe that the American policy in Latin America doesn't feel designed for that moment. It's still designed for the 90s or something, where there's an assumption that of a certain democratic trajectory within which we build like initiatives. I think we have to pay much more attention to democracy in our own hemisphere. And when I say that, I don't mean just the rhetoric, because we always give the rhetoric, but the rhetoric is not connecting with people because it feels out of date, I think.
So question 4 is kind of sprawling. It's from Anonymous. How do we deal with Orban, with the migrant crisis in Europe on the border between Belarus and Poland, and with Russia and China's growing influence in the Balkan region?
So I think
maybe that's asking you to provide a whole foreign policy.
Yeah, I guess.
Answer.
Yeah, so because there's a whole answer in my book about how do you deal with Orban in Hungary, because I talked to the Hungarian opposition, and they've done something interesting in unifying the entire opposition to take Orban on next year in an election, and have like a fighting chance against him because of that. But the tenor of your question is more foreign policy focused, so I'll give a foreign policy answer, which is we the U.S. and Europe need to make our own institutions actually prioritize democracy. What do I mean by that? Well, Hungary, all the corruption I talked about, how did Orban, enrich a bunch of cronies who could then finance his politics and buy up the media? It was with European Union funds. The EU gives huge grants each year to Hungary for things like infrastructure. And then Orban, and I detail this in the book, from the work of my anti-corruption characters, but he just skims massive amounts off the top in the contracts that he gives to his buddies. And like the richest man in Hungary was once a pipe fitter. He was a high school friend of Orban's, now he's a billionaire. It's not subtle what happened there. But the EU never turns off this spigot, because they've never put democracy and the rule of law ahead of economic interests, in making those calculations. Hungary is still in NATO. which is supposed to be an alliance of democracies, and so then what happens? You have these soft spots, right, that are entry points for China and Russia to gain more influence. And so another Hungarian example, the largest production center for Huawei outside of China is in Hungary, which gets them into the EU market, gets them made in the EU stamp on their Huawei technology. The Belt Road Initiative is moving heavily into the Balkans, as was mentioned, and with it, all the corruption that comes with that, which is usually, erodes political institutions. And so I think the starting place has to be saying, whether it's NATO, the EU, I would rather have a strong democratic bloc that also is making decisions in its foreign policies based on democratic values and democracy ahead of these other interests, which are usually economic interests. Now, that I actually think that's not just a values-based argument. I think it's an interest-based argument, because allowing China and Russia to begin to pull at the threads, or they're not begin, they already, to continue to pull at the threads that weave together the liberal order, is going to dramatically weaken the position of the United States and the European Union. Whereas if we are unified and firm in defense of our interests and values, we're in a stronger position on a host of things.
Okay, here's a question from John Pandal. You mentioned how authoritarians portray the US as equally corrupt. How do authoritarians portray international organizations like the UN or non-governmental organizations?
I think there are two ways. I mean, the first is they kind of sabotage some of them, right? So Russia and China have basically rendered the UN Security Council meaningless. They don't intervene, certainly on any issue that has a nexus to humanitarianism or democracy. There's no expectation anymore that the UN Security, right now there's like a potential crisis in Ethiopia that could dwarf Syria in terms of loss of life and displaced peoples, and that's saying something. And nobody would ever expect the UN Security Council would do anything about that, or look at Myanmar. And so part of it is that they sabotage the functioning of the system to make the system obsolete. They also are more effectively cast the World Bank and IMF as kind of these tools of American and capitalist control. Everybody, you're always having to take an austerity plan to sign up, and lo and behold, here comes China with money to build infrastructure, which moves much faster than the World Bank or the IMF. Now, they end up being debt traps. so there's a flaw in it's not like the Chinese have figured out how to give people free money. But I think that the basic premise, right, is to discredit and make dysfunctional the kind of US-led institutional order around the world, create a parallel set of institutions, right? That's what the Belt Road Initiative is and stuff, that are mainly commercial in nature, but come with a degree of political influence. And so there really is no functioning agreed upon global order. There's just powerful nations competing with each other.
Here's a question from our friend Jamie Kabler, and I'm hoping I can get to a few more of these before we have to conclude. Ben, you helped negotiate the opening to Cuba. What's happening there now, and what's your prediction about where events will take us?
I mean, I nothing has been more disappointing to me. I think essentially we negotiate this opening in the last 2 years. There's an enormous amount of hope unleashed in Cuba. As part of the agreement, they bring internet access to Cuba. There's a lot more interaction between Americans and Cubans. And so expectations are rising on the island. Then Trump slams the doors shut and starts piling sanctions back on. And then the powder keg starts to build in Cuba, but a lot of people meanwhile are suffering because of these sanctions. And now you're in a situation where Cubans are more pissed off than they've been because they've had this whiplash. With us, they've had this change, and there's no Castros in charge anymore. So there's this kind of post-revolutionary generation in charge. It doesn't have, the same legitimacy, whatever you think of the Castros. There's not even like, why am I hearing about the revolution from this guy? I want some food on the table. And I think the Biden team has made a terrible calculation to just, because I think if you open things up, different places, require different solutions. And an island 90 miles of Florida, opening things up will change things. It will make people's lives better in the immediate term because they won't be punished anymore under this embargo. And there's no scenario in which I think this government can prevent change if there's a tremendous amount of activity, information, economic activity, and travel flowing through Cuba. So I think that every dial that we turn on the pressure valve is just extending the capacity of this regime to hold on to a system that should work. But my assessment is the Biden team doesn't want to take on it's not substance, because all these same people were with me in government when we did the opposite. I think politically they've just decided, it's not a fight they want to have.
Maybe our Cuba policy is a Florida policy.
It's a Florida policy, and let's face it, like Senator Menendez is the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee that confirms every one of their nominees for an ambassador. There's just it's tough politics. I mean, even though it's one of these bizarre issues, Bob, where the American people, if you poll them, like, do you want to have the ability to travel to Cuba? It's like 90%. Do you support lifting the embargo? It's like 60%. But it's Florida politics, and coupled with the weird like joining of communism, attacks on communism in Cuba. It's all Florida and a handful of powerful people in Congress.
Yeah, there are two questions here that overlap, so I'm just going to put them together. In terms of regulating social media, how can we determine what misinformation is and who gets to remove it? Who becomes the ultimate arbiter of truth? You say this is within the American purview, but we can't control technologies very well, even within our own borders. What exactly should we do with Facebook, Twitter, and all these other sites to stop the spread of conspiracy theories, hate speech, and to stop facilitating authoritarianism around the world?
So the quick answer I get to that, knowing we don't have a lot of time, is that the scale of the problem compels action. I described the end of the book, Obama saying to me, okay, well, there's always been authoritarians. What's different now? What's different now is that the technology, never mind the Chinese version of total control, in this country, 45% of people can believe something that is totally untrue because of technology. That Donald Trump won the election, or a healthy chunk of people can believe that the world is run by a cabal of child sex traffickers. These things are new. This is a new feature in the political landscape, that technology can radicalize people and scale up conspiracy theory to this extent. I think these algorithms, the tech companies try to make you believe that the algorithms don't make choices that human beings do. That's not true. The algorithms are written in a way to turbocharge the spread of sensational information. They are written to achieve engagement as the metric of success. And something that is angering or triggering is what they're designed to spread. And so I think that there's a technologist piece of this and a policy objective piece of this, in terms of how do you have algorithms at Facebook, at YouTube, other places that aren't immediately sending people down the worst possible rabbit holes, which they are. And if you look at a lot of the whistleblower stuff, the people know that inside of these companies. And so that's the kind of meta problem you have to get your arms around, to use an unfortunate word, I guess, given the recent Facebook launch. But the last thing is on the more extreme cases around hate speech and incitement, I think introducing liability for the companies. You wouldn't let a newspaper publish something day after day after day after day that would incite people to storm the Capitol and kill people and try to overthrow American democracy. I think that treating these platforms like they are not media companies, and allowing them to avoid any liability for what's on their platform or the consequences of what's on their platform. That's not how we in America approach like any other industry. It'd be like saying the car makers have no liability for, a glitch in their cars that demands a recall. This is a public safety crisis. And so again, there's very particular, difficult, thorny questions, but those two principles, that you have to slow down the dissemination of triggering information, which tends to be conspiracy theory and hate speech, and that you have to introduce the concept of liability, I think have to be a part of that discussion.
We have one last really interesting question. We're not going to have time to get to it. It was basically, have recent events corroborated or altered the continuum of growing autocracies around the world, especially since the election of Biden?
Short answer is yes.
Okay.
But there's hope.
Yeah. So I want to thank Ben, and I want to thank all of you who are here with us today. Our mission at the center is to be open to the spectrum of different views while respecting each other and respecting the truth. Today was a strong take on our present condition and our future. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ben. See you in January, and pod save the world.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Bob. Good to see you.